So this is example 4 for the 3.4 day 1 notes. So here we're going to find the inverse of a nonlinear function. Our nonlinear function is f of x equals negative 5x squared. Notice this is a quadratic function because we have x squared. So let's draw or sketch what this might look like. So our quadratic will kind of look like this. Remember, because we have a negative a value, it's facing down. But if we look over here, we have now x is greater than or equal to 0. This is actually where we're restricting the domain. So because we're restricting the domain, we're only finding the inverse of a certain part of our function here. So we look back at our sketch of our graph. We only want x values that are positive or greater than 0. So we're only looking really at this part of our graph here. Okay, so now in order to find the inverse, I'm going to rewrite this. Now instead of saying f of x, I'm going to write y. Y and f of x mean the exact same thing. Remember to switch your x and y variables. So that's our next step. So we now have x equals negative 5y squared. And now what we're going to do is we're going to solve for y. So the first thing is I need to divide both sides by negative 5 to get rid of that. So now I have y squared equals negative x over 5. And because we got to get y all by itself, I need to take the square root on both sides. So now I have y equals, and remember, whenever we take the square root, we have the plus, minus, and then we have square root of negative x over 5. Now, if we were not restricting the domain at the beginning, this would be our final answer. But because we are, we have to actually decide what y values we can have. Now remember, whenever we're finding the inverse, we are basically reflecting over the y equals x line. So our inverse, which I'm going to do in red, would actually look like this if we reflected our function over the line y equals x. So now we have to see what values we can have for y, okay? Now, so we know for our function here that our domain, right, just rewriting our domain is x values are greater than 0. Whenever you do the inverses and you switch your x and y variables, you also switch the domain and range. I'll write that down here. So when you switch, and I'll just type this out, be a little bit faster. So when you switch x and y, you switch your domain and range. What this means is now the domain of this original function, negative 5x squared, is now becoming the range of our inverse function. So let's figure out what our range needs to be on our inverse function. Now remember, range is our y values. So that's what we have to figure out here. Now if our domain was x is greater than or equal to 0, and we're swapping, that means our range on our inverse function now has to be, remember we use y for range, y is greater than or equal to 0. Now if you're still a little bit confused, let's look at this graph here, right? Remember the red was the inverse function. Well, our x values here, right, the horizontal line, those are negative, but if you look at the graph, all our y values are above 0. So that means our y values do have to be positive. So because our y values have to be positive, we cannot use this negative sign as part of our answer. So our final answer here will have y equals, and we only want the positives because with the negatives we would make it negative y's. So our final answer would be y equals negative x over 5. And this would be our inverse to our function negative 5x squared, where the domain is restricted x is greater than or equal to 0.